This is Spectrum.
Alternative medicine, homeopathy, secret society, hypnosis, the paranormal, alternative energy, UFO, abduction, the weird, the wild, and the wonderful.
With your hosts, Tom Theophanous and Scott Jordan.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Spectrum Radio Network on BBS Radio 2. This is Scott Jordan here with my co-host, Tom Theophanous, and remember, there's no such thing as too much information. Hey, Tom, how you doing?
I'm good. Well, we have another great guest today. His name is Craig Farraway. He started out at a young age playing the drums, singing, and writing songs. At the age of 21, he wrote and performed the title track for an album dedicated to the Calgary Olympics in 1988. The song, Dream on the Horizon, was featured in a CBC documentary and received regular airplay on FM stations across Canada. Motivated by high prices of commercial beer and his love for the beverage, Greg, at age 21 at the time, started experimenting with beer kits from his local home brewing shop. Well, 20 years later, he's still at it. He now has a popular YouTube channel, which he apparently named CraigTube. He attracted literally thousands of followers, and I believe there's over 6,000 of them. Many of them which claim that they never would have started home brewing if it weren't for Craig. Craig also does a variety of other things on his YouTube channel, including cooking shows, music performances, and philosophical talks, with topics ranging from paranormal, the nature of the universe, but, of course, the main theme on his channel still is beer.
Wow.
Hey there, it's Craig here.
Yeah, isn't that amazing, eh?
That's the way I usually start my programs, so just a little joke.
Awesome. Well, that's great.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Pleasure to have you. The topic today is beer, so what can you tell me about that?
Beer. Beer is...
beer, glorious beer.
Yeah. According to Wikipedia, it's the third most popular drink after water and tea. So it's very popular. Americans, Canadians, and Europeans love their beer. And, it goes back, it dates back over 10,000 years ago, where it was first discovered. So it's not really known exactly how it was discovered. It was probably stumbled upon. We're not sure. It wouldn't be that difficult to be making bread one day and accidentally mix up some yeast with some cereal grains and maybe notice something going on. And we'll get into that a little bit as when we talk about how it works. But yeah, there's quite a history to beer and how it came over to the United States and Canada.
Wow.
So I could go into that, I guess, if you want.
I'd love it. Yeah, I'm sure. Give me a history lesson. I'm always open for that.
Well, the main ingredients of beer, first of all, are malted barley. And you probably were wondering what malted barley is. Well, I'll get into that a little bit later. But it's a grain. It's a cereal grain. And hops, which is a flowery kind of green herbal sort of thing. It's a leafy cone-shaped or aromatic thing. It has aromatic properties, bittering properties.
I have one in my garden, by the way.
Oh, well, and if you smell one of these things, it has almost a mixture between grass and sort of a citrusy smell to it. And there's lots of different types of hops, which give the beers different flavors. And it also depends on when you add them. And of course, there's a lot of experimentation goes on. But the beer has been around. It's not a new thing. In fact, the Pilgrims came over to in 1620 when they loaded the Mayflower up with pilgrims. They loaded it up with food and beer. And as a matter of fact, and we're talking 1600s, 1620 here, As a matter of fact, they actually ended up dropping off the Pilgrims early. They didn't actually take them to where they were supposed to take them. They actually said, hey, you got to leave now because we're running out of beer. So the crew members were worried they were going to run out of beer, so they dropped them off. And I'm not an American historian, so I don't know all the details of the Pilgrims, but that's basically what the story is. So, and so the Pilgrims, they settled here, in the United States. They immediately started making their own beer. And everyone drank it all day. Basically, you got up in the morning, you drank your beer, you drank it until you went to bed. There must have been a lot of drunk people around there. But even the children used to drink it. Now, they made something called small beer, which what they would do is they would take the grains that they used to make their beer, and they would reuse the same grains, something like reusing a tea bag for a second time. And they would make a less potent version of beer for the kids to drink. So, yeah. And so after a while, it started to die off, beer drinking. It started to become replaced with whiskey. And then a whole pile of Germans came over. And they brought over their favorite beer, which was a lager-style beer. And lager-style beers are brewed differently than ale beers, because they're brewed at lower temperatures, and there's different characteristics to the beer. It's a very clean, refreshing beer, and so that caught on. And it wasn't long before breweries started popping up and, jump forward a few hundred years, and now we've got big industry involved, and now we don't make our own beer anymore. Just like we don't make our own bread anymore, we rely on industry to make it. But some of us still do make our own, and there's different reasons for that. But I just wanted to give a little bit of a history, and a lot of people don't really understand how beer is made, and it's been being made for many years for in the same way. There are different ways of making beer, but I'll just go over basically the traditional way of making beer, which is you take the malted barley. Now, malted barley is a grain that's basically like a cereal, and what malting does to it is they germinate it. They moisten it so that it starts to sprout. Okay. And then right when it sprouts, they immediately dry the grains so they stop sprouting. And what this does is it creates a situation where there's starches inside the grain. And what you do is then you take the grain and you submerge it in hot water at certain temperatures for certain periods of time. And it's different, everyone's got but basically for an hour and a half, you submerge it in hot water. And what happens is the starches convert into sugars. And why is that important? Well, we'll go into that a little bit later. So then what you end up with after this is finished, you rinse off the grains. You basically, rinse them off, get all the goodness off of them, and you separate them and you remove them. And now you've got a liquid, which is called, it's called wort or wort. There's two different ways of pronouncing it. It's W-O-R-T, and there's some argument over how it's pronounced, but I've been told it depends on where you're from. Some people pronounce it wort and some people wort, but it doesn't matter. And what you do is you take that and you boil it. Okay? And you add your hops at the specific times, and that adds your bitterness and your flavor. And then you boil that for an hour or so. And then you cool that down and you add your yeast to it. And yeast is a major ingredient in beer because it's what causes the fermentation. So, if as far as fermentation goes, that's a word some people don't understand. Fermentation happens naturally, and that's why we think that maybe they stumbled upon beer by accident. If you take yeast, and I'm talking any kind of yeast, whether it be grocery store yeast or brewer's yeast or whatever, and you mix it with a solution that's sweet with sugar, like a sugary solution, the yeast eats the sugar and turns it into alcohol. Well, it eats the sugar, and as a byproduct, it gives off alcohol and carbon dioxide. And so that's how the alcohol is produced. So when you make your beer, you take your grains and you do, what I said, where you soak them and you convert the starches into sugars. You end up with that sweet wort, which is basically a grain juice, And when you add your yeast to that, the yeast eats the sugars that were created and creates the alcohol. And of course, the malt flavors come through. You've got your malt flavors, you've got your alcohol, you've got your hops. That's what your beer is.
Wow.
Okay.
When you're saying that, I'm getting an image. You mentioned something about ancient man discovered it by accident. I had an image pop up into my head of the first ancient drunk man. I can take that mammoth all by myself. Going out there and beating the crap out of him. I just had this ancient man image, the first drunk guy. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, hey, good imagery. And so the very last thing you have to worry about with beer is carbonation, and that's not a big deal. When the beer ferments, it ferments and the important thing about making any kind of alcoholic beverage like this is that fermentation happens naturally. All the garbage bins and recycle bins and green bins of the world, it's happening every day, every night, all the time. But if you open your garbage bin, it doesn't smell very good because there's a lot of bacteria and other things going on there besides fermentation, because yeast is everywhere. It's in the air, it's floating around. There's all kinds of wild yeast strains floating around. And if you leave an orange on the table for long enough, it will eventually rot. And part of that process is because they're yeasts that are in the air, eat the sugars, and it starts to ferment. So, when you make a beer beverage or a wine beverage, what you're doing is you're sanitizing everything. So first of all, you're boiling the wort, so you're killing everything that was in there, and you're sanitizing all your equipment that you use to ferment the wort. So you're basically creating a situation where the only organism that is going to be able to infect your wort is the yeast that you add.
Right.
Okay. Everything else gets kind of locked out, and that's why it doesn't rot and go stinky and nasty. And then, so then what you do is you bottle it, or you keg it, or you do something with it to carbonate it. And carbonating is basically you put your beer in your bottles, you add a little bit of sugar to each bottle, you put the beer in there, you cap it. This is after it's fermented for a couple of weeks, and there's different ways of. Some people transfer their beer to a secondary fermentation bucket or pail or carboy to let it settle and age and that kind of thing. This is all on my channel, my YouTube channel, CraigTube. The videos are all there. And then when you go to bottle your beer, you add a little bit of sugar to each bottle, put the beer in there, cap it off, and then what happens is the yeast that's in the beer goes, oh, look, there's a little more food down there. Let's go and eat that. So it eats that little bit of sugar, and it again creates a little bit of alcohol and some carbon dioxide. Now, the carbon dioxide can't escape anymore because it doesn't have any way of getting out, so it forces itself into the beer, and that's how you get your bubbles. That's the sort of the nuts and bolts of it. There's the basic premise of it. There's lots of different ways of doing it, and I know it sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. It's quite simple.
Well, I had a kind of a crazy question asked of us earlier. Have you ever heard of anybody who tried to make beer out of grains that were in crop circles?
Crop circles. You had to get that stuff in the interview, didn't you?
It was a question that was asked of us.
The basis of your program is to talk about those kinds of things.
Hey, that's why we're here.
Hey, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that question.
It wasn't my question. It was somebody's question.
No.
Wow, that's a good beer.
This all sounds. It can. What I described to you there is. It's called all grain brewing, and that's the traditional way of making beer. And a good portion of the home brewers these days still do it that way.